was still warm in my hand when Denise's phone went off. She was already moving through the lobby, her heels clicking against the travertine floor with the particular rhythm of someone who believes they've won. Her husband Craig had his arm around her shoulder, and they were leaning into each other the way people do when they're sharing a private joke or a private victory. I watched them from across the atrium, my signed name still drying on a stack of documents I had just handed to the estate's notary, and I felt something settle quietly in my chest. Not peace exactly, more like the stillness before a controlled demolition. She answered without looking at the screen because she was expecting champagne news. What she got instead made the color leave her face. In a single visible wave, her attorney's voice erupted through the speaker loud enough that the receptionist at the front desk looked up from her computer. Don't let her leave that building. The signature may already be void. His words tumbled over each other in a register. I had never heard from him before, not the measured, slightly theatrical calm he performed in my living room 2 weeks earlier. Cornered. She signed. Tell me she hasn't signed. There's a clause. I just found it. Vivian, listen to me. Denise's hand closed around the phone so hard her knuckles went white, but the lobby was quiet, and the damage was already done. Craig turned slowly and found my face across the atrium. I didn't look away. I should explain how I got there, because the lobby scene makes more sense once you understand what the previous 14 months had cost me. My father's diagnosis arrived on a Tuesday in February, the kind of gray administrative Tuesday that has no business hosting life-altering news. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The oncologist used the phrase aggressive trajectory, which is a clinical way of saying that time was the one resource we couldn't buy more of. Within 3 weeks, our family home in Larkspur had been reorganized around a hospital grade bed, an oxygen concentrator, and a medication schedule that ran on a whiteboard I updated every morning before my first cup of coffee. I am a healthcare compliance auditor by profession. I spend my days reading the fine print inside the fine print, reviewing billing codes, flagging procedural irregularities, building documentation trails that hold up under regulatory scrutiny. It is detail work, quiet work, the kind of work that makes people's eyes glaze over at dinner parties. It also meant that when my father's insurance carrier began denying claims for palliative medications, I wrote 3 of them. I won to my sister Vivian, who is 4 years older than me and runs what she calls a lifestyle brand consultancy. She arrived most weekends carrying an iced beverage and a rehearsed expression of concern, and she left within the hour, usually citing a client call or a brand partnership deadline her husband Craig accompanied her on. Roughly half these visits, his contribution to my father's care was to stand over the kitchen counter reading the medical invoices with the theatrical distress of a man being personally wronged by hospice billing. Are we really hemorrhaging this much every month? He would ask this to no one in particular, as though the numbers on the page were a moral failing rather than the cost of keeping a dying man comfortable. He never offered $1, neither did Vivian. I stopped expecting them to. What I did not anticipate was that my willingness to carry the weight would be interpreted over time as an agreement to carry it permanently. The inheritance conversation began at the reception following my father's memorial service. Began is perhaps too gentle a word. Vivian cornered me in the dining room while the catering staff was still clearing the dessert plates. She had a folder, of course. She had a folder. Inside it were printouts she described as tax assessments and lien documentation figures, highlighted in red columns of numbers, designed to suggest catastrophe. She explained in a tone of sisterly anguish that my father's properties were buried under years of unpaid tax liability, that accepting my share of the estate would mean assuming that debt, that she and Craig had spoken with their attorney and were prepared reluctantly, generously, to absorb the full burden themselves. She said this while my father had been in the ground for approximately 4 hours. Over the following 10 days, Craig's voicemails became a genre unto themselves. Each one arrived with fresh urgency, new deadlines, escalating consequences. For my hesitation, the tax agency would freeze accounts. The window to negotiate with creditors was closing. My silence was being interpreted, he said, a stubbornness that would cost the entire family. Vivian sent texts that managed to be simultaneously wounded and threatening, a tonal combination I had not previously believed possible. I am a compliance auditor. My entire professional existence is built on the premise that numbers, when examined carefully, tell the truth. The numbers in Vivian's folder did not tell the truth. I noticed the first discrepancy on a Thursday evening working through the lien documentation with a highlighter and a glass of water. I brought the folder to my friend Paloma the following morning. Because Paloma is a former title insurance examiner, she identified 3 more inconsistencies. Before lunch, the assessed valuations didn't match public records. A lien Figure cited a tax period that didn't correspond to any filing. My father had made the urgency, the deadlines, the red numbers, all of it had the architecture of a performance rather than a crisis. I purchased a voice recorder at an electronic shop on Clement Street that afternoon, small, unremarkable, easily secured inside the interior pocket of my bag. I tested it twice in my car before driving home. Then I called Vivian and suggested we meet for dinner to discuss the estate details one final time before I made my decision. She agreed immediately. People who believe they've already won tend to be accommodating. We met at a restaurant in the Larkspur Landing district. Quiet, good acoustics, the kind of place where the lighting flatters everyone, and the booths offered genuine privacy. I ordered a glass of water and activated the recorder before the menus arrived. I asked with careful neutrality what would happen if I chose to retain my share of the estate and address the tax liabilities directly through the county assessor's office. Craig's response was disproportionate in a way that would have been useful for anyone listening. He struck the table hard enough to shift the glassware, leaned across toward me, and explained in explicit terms that if I disrupted their arrangement, he would pursue civil litigation to recover every dollar of medical expenses he claimed to have paid during my father's illness. He had not paid any. He named figures, he named consequences. He used the phrase, make your life very difficult in this city, with the confidence of a man who had never been recorded before. Vivian added several things that I will not repeat because the transcript was sufficient. 2 days later, I sat across from my family's estate attorney, Mr. Farron, in his conference room on 4th Street. Vivian had positioned herself directly beside his desk. Craig stood near the door, not suddenly, not accidentally. He was blocking it. Mr. Farron had prepared the waiver according to Vivian's instructions, and it sat on the table with a pen laid across it at a precise angle. I performed uncertainty very well. I asked Mr. Farron whether if I declined to sign, I would be solely responsible for the debt Vivian had described. I asked it with a slight tremor. I had practiced before he could answer. Vivian answered for him, confirming every fabricated detail loudly enough for the room and the recorder to capture clearly. Then I picked up the pen and signed every page. The satisfaction on their faces was something I filed away carefully, the way you file away evidence you intend to use. In the hallway outside the conference room, I had 4 minutes alone. I used them to upload the audio file to the court's electronic submission portal and to forward a copy to Vivian's attorney directly. By the time I walked into the lobby, the documentation was already in transit. What you need to understand about my father's original trust is that he was not an unsophisticated man. He had built his estate carefully, and he had worked with a cautious attorney who had included in the original trust language a forfeiture provision. Any named beneficiary found to have employed coercion, fraud, or extortion against another beneficiary in connection with estate proceedings would forfeit their own claim entirely. It was a clause that had probably never been triggered before it was about to be triggered completely. Vivian's attorney called her approximately 9 minutes after I signed the waiver. I watched it happen. From across the atrium, I watched the phone come out of her bag, the casual confidence of the speakerphone button, and then the systematic removal of color from her face as her own lawyer described in increasingly frantic terms exactly what I had submitted and exactly what it would cost her. Craig turned and found me watching them. I held his gaze for a moment, then I walked out through the glass doors into the afternoon. The court's ruling came down 11 weeks later. The waiver was nullified on the grounds of documented coercive duress. Vivian's inheritance claim was forfeited under the trust's own terms. Mr. Farron's counterpart, the aggressive private attorney who had performed in my living room, received a referral to the State Bar's Ethics Review Committee for his role in the process. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be precise about this, because the story is easy to misread. What I felt mostly was tired in a way that didn't require an audience. I blocked both of their numbers. I deleted the contact entries entirely. I used a portion of the estate to pay down the credit I had accumulated during my father's illness, and I put a deposit on a small condo in a neighborhood where I don't have a history with anyone. I had one session with a therapist who told me that grief and relief are not mutually exclusive, that you can miss someone and also be grateful you no longer have to manage the people around them. I found that useful. The rest, I'm still working through. What I keep returning to is this: I was useful to my family for over a year, and that Usefulness was eventually reframed as obligation. The transition was so gradual, I almost missed it. There's a version of this story where I don't buy the recorder, where exhaustion wins over habit, and I sign the papers without a plan, and the waiver holds. I think about that version sometimes, not with relief exactly, but with a kind of attention, as though it's useful to keep the near miss visible. I want to ask you something, and I mean it as a genuine question rather than a closing flourish. If the people who were supposed to protect you were the ones constructing the threat, how long would it take you to recognize it, and what would you be willing to do once you did?